Hello, and welcome back to our afternoon session of the Leo Steinberg seminar or symposium. Leo Steinberg, collector, critic, and scholar at the Blanton Museum of Art. We've had a lovely morning session, and we are thrilled to welcome two speakers for our afternoon session, virtually, of course. This is just a reminder, your audio is muted. We are in a webinar format. No one can hear you, and we'll be taking your questions in the Q&A at the bottom. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a little icon Q&A. You can drop your questions in there for either speaker. We'll be saving those till the end and then addressing those after both speakers have finished. Let me go ahead and introduce our first speaker for this afternoon session. This is Bernadine Barnes. She's professor of Renaissance art history at Wake Forest University. She's interested in how contemporary audiences of differing genders or social groups gain access to works of art and how contemporary viewers respond to images. She's written 4 books, including Michelangelo in Print, and most recently, Michelangelo and the Viewer in His Time, published in 2018. The talk is pre-recorded, and then all of our Q&A, of course, will be live.
Hello, everyone. Nice to see you all.
Hello, and thank you all for being here. If you are listening to this in Austin, I envy you, and I cannot wait to see the exhibit and to make my way down there myself. If you are listening from someplace else, thank you, of course, for being here. I'd also like to thank Holly Borham for organizing the exhibit and this symposium, and a special thanks to Sheila Schwartz, who has made my life very easy by collecting all of Leo Steinberg's essays about Michelangelo in 2 very nice volumes that just came out in the last couple of years. I am not going to talk about everything that Leo Steinberg thought about Michelangelo. That would take much, much longer than 30 minutes. But I am going to talk about his collecting of prints and the way he used them in his work. Leo Steinberg gave the Blanton Museum about 3,500 prints, and of these, approximately 70 reproduce works of art by Michelangelo. I'm showing you 3 of them. This gives you some sense of the range of his collection. And on the left, we see a detail from the Battle of Cascina. It's actually taken from a drawing from the cartoon, which no longer survives, and in fact, the painting never was completed. This is done by Marcantonio Raimondi around 1508. The work on the upper right is a detail from the Sistine Chapel ceiling, shows the prophet Jeremiah, and it is done by Giorgio Ghisi around 1570. That's about 60 years after the Sistine Chapel ceiling was completed. It took an enormously long time for the prints, for substantial and detailed prints of the Sistine Chapel ceiling to be produced, and this is one of the best of them. Down below that is a detail from The Last Judgment. This is by Conrad Metz, and it was made in the early 19th century. These later reproductions, done in the later 18th and early 19th century, just before photography becomes important, are not given much play in the scholarship on the prints. I think they deserve more attention than they get. So it's a testament to Leo Steinberg's range, really, that he even paid attention to them. In fact, it's a testament to his, shall we say, his unorthodox approach to things that he paid attention to these prints at all. He talks in one of his articles about how he would go through the 50-cent bin at a print dealer's looking for these kinds of prints that were not valued when he first started collecting them. These are all reproductions, and in fact, collectors in general still value original prints. Certainly they value original drawings more than prints in general, but they value original prints that were made by the artist, him or herself, for example, by Rembrandt. These are copies. These are made by other artists, sometimes hundreds of years after the original was made. but they're valuable sources of information, and I think Leo Steinberg would say that they are themselves responses to Michelangelo's work that are worth paying attention to. I believe there are three basic ways that Steinberg uses prints to support his interpretations of Michelangelo's work. The first is just to look for details in the prints as evidence of figures or objects that maybe other people have not noticed. He also uses them to support iconographic interpretations, and finally he uses them as evidence of responses to particular ideas that Michelangelo might have had. I want to start with this first idea that prints can give us evidence of certain details that perhaps other people did not notice. And the reason why Steinberg notices them is that he often would draw these figures. He would draw the prints, he would copy the copies, he would draw the actual, he would make his own copies of the fresco itself. So what I want to focus on here is the figure down in the lower right corner of the fresco. This is the character that is usually identified as Minos, and we are interested in a particular anecdote that is told about this figure. The master of ceremonies of the Sistine Chapel was a man named Biagio da Cesena. Well, Biagio came in to see work on the fresco when Michelangelo was really pretty close to being done. And frankly, he was appalled. He saw all the nudity, he saw some of the other figures that he found sacrilegious probably, and complained. Well, Michelangelo was not happy to hear this, so when Biagio left, he actually drew his portrait. He put his portrait within the lower corner of hell. That's the story. Now, most people think that the portrait of Biagio da Cesena is this figure of Minos, this snarling face of Minos. But Steinberg did not agree. He did not think a figure this important and this deliberate could be that kind of a figure and would not have been done that quickly. So he proposed a different figure. Steinberg thought that the actual portrait of Biagio da Cesena was a little bit higher up in the fresco, and it is that detail that I have marked out with the white square and then a closer view of it in the center. You see that image of the older man kind of peering in from the side and done in a very quick and sketchy sort of a way. It is the sort of a thing that Michelangelo could have painted very quickly. It is inserted in a pretty inconspicuous part of the fresco. It makes sense in terms of immediately responding to the criticism that he had heard. But there are some people who think that, in fact, that figure is not even part of the original painting. So Steinberg looked to prints, looked to the prints of the Last Judgment, and there are many, including the very large-scale print by Beatrice that we're seeing a detail of in the lower right corner. And as you can see, that same figure, that older man, does show up in that detail. In fact, it shows up in all the prints of the Last Judgment. Now, what Biagio da Cesena and many other people were complaining about, of course, is the extreme quantity of nudity and some other very specific details within the Last Judgment. The most appalling of these, for most critics, are the two figures I have pointed out in white boxes on these two slides. First, in the detail from the fresco itself that we see on the left, and then again from Beatrice's very large engraving of the print of the Last Judgment. As you can see in the fresco itself, the fresco itself has been changed. It has been censored in a sense, and you can see the censorship by looking for all the dark brown loincloths that you see on figures, the figure carrying the cross, for example, or the figure holding the skin over on the left side of this detail. Many of the figures have their genitalia covered with loincloths. But those two saints in the box are St. Blaise and St. Catherine. And they were originally in a much more compromised pose. We see Blaise, who is hovering over St. Catherine with his curry combs. That's his attribute. St. Catherine herself is naked to the waist, at least, a very voluptuous woman, and she is bent over and looking back up at St. Blaise as if to question what he is doing. This is almost verbatim what the critic said about this. The prints themselves all show what the painting looked like before it was censored, before it was changed. So this is another instance of how the prints give us evidence for what the painting actually looked like. The second important way that Steinberg uses prints in his research on Michelangelo is to support iconographic interpretations. We're looking here at three sculptures by Michelangelo. The first, the Pietà from 1498. In the center is a tondo, a round relief sculpture called the Taddei Tondo from 1504. And then on the right side, the Medici Madonna from the 1520s, which is now in the Medici Chapel. All three of them show the Virgin Mary in an intimate pose with her son. In the Pietà, Steinberg points out how closely Christ's body melds with the Virgin Mary's and how he sinks in between her legs as if recalling the idea of his physical birth from her body. The two other sculptures show what's called the Slung Leg Motif that Steinberg thought about a lot in his career. In this, the male figure throws his leg, in this case the Christ child, throws his leg over the thigh of the Virgin Mary. Now, this kind of a pose would not seem too extraordinary for a young child. This is just a squirming baby, after all. But as Steinberg found out from studying prints, there is a highly sexualized meaning behind this pose. Here again is the Medici Madonna, and next to it are two engravings, one by the German artist Heinrich Aldegraver and the other by the Italian artist Giulio Bonassone. They are examples that could be replaced with many others, actually. They both post-date the works we've been looking at, but what they're being called up for is to show that this motif existed and circulated and was well recognized within the realm of prints and therefore within the minds of the artists who were making works of art like this. Steinberg was very adamant that art historians should know about prints, should use them, and should realize that artists of the time had these kinds of images in their vocabularies. And that is really what's behind his use of these in the interpretation. Not so much that Michelangelo would have seen any particular print, but that he knew this theme and knew these meanings. We're looking here at two prints that are really almost pornographic in their meaning. And in both cases, the woman throws her leg over the thigh of the man and, in a sense, covers up his genitalia, but at the same time he is prying apart her own legs. They're intertwined in a way that is extremely provocative. And to bring this kind of a pose to bear on images of the Virgin and Christ really is a little problematic and hard for some scholars to accept. But it does seem that Michelangelo used exactly this kind of pose in his late Pietà, not the last one he did, but one that he began in 1547 and intended to be placed on his own tomb. The implication, though, of the sexuality of Christ here in relationship to his own mother might have been disturbing to Michelangelo himself, because in 1553 or thereabouts, he decided to destroy this sculpture. He took a hammer to it and broke off the leg that would have been over the Virgin Mary's thigh. He also broke up parts of the Virgin herself, as well as Mary Magdalene. The work was repaired by a follower of Michelangelo, repaired at least to a certain extent. It still shows much damage, and it particularly shows that that leg that Michelangelo broke off never was replaced. What you see on the left side is the socket that Calcagni produced to put a new leg into this sculpture, but in fact it does not exist. There are some scholars who really questioned whether that is the way the leg would have looked, and Steinberg rightly points to not only the indentation on the lap of the Virgin Mary, but also to this print by Cherubino Alberti, done in 1580. This is long after the leg was broken off, and as I said, it had not been replaced, but Cherubino Alberti followed out the logic of where the leg would have been, and in a sense recreated it in his own engraving. He also set the sculptural group within a setting that gives it even more poignancy, in front of the tomb in which Christ's body will be placed, with Calvary in the background. And this brings us to the third way that Leo Steinberg used prints in his interpretations of Michelangelo's work, and that is to think of prints as responses to his work, or in a way to think of them as expressions of the common understanding of these themes, and then setting Michelangelo's own work and the variations between these two things, between the original and the prints, as a kind of a dialogue between the two, between the expectation and what Michelangelo intended. This is where the idea of the line of fate comes in, and I use this concept in the title of my talk, playing a little bit on the idea of engravings, prints being made from lines, but the idea that Steinberg has of the line of fate actually has to do with the line drawn between figures in paintings that express Michelangelo's fate. So it's a rather different kind of concept. In the article that he wrote in 1980 called The Line of Fate, he actually recapitulates some ideas about this kind of line, meaningful line that goes between figures within his work, and does this by beginning with the Crucifixion of St. Peter, Michelangelo's last painting, which is in the Pauline Chapel. This is done in the 1540s, and it is a pair with the conversion of St. Paul that is in the same chapel. But the ideas are worked out with the Last Judgment, and we'll be seeing that. And then Steinberg also extends his argument, and I think really this is what the article called The Line of Fate is about. It's about showing that this notion of the diagonal line, the meaningful diagonal line, shows up in many of Michelangelo's work, starting with the Sistine Chapel ceiling and continuing in through the Last Judgment and through the Pauline Chapel. The Pauline Chapel frescoes are not works that were reproduced very often in print. There are a few prints, and as Steinberg points out, generally speaking, the prints change the format of the paintings. The original format is quite square, and as you can see in this particular version, this is by Giovanni Battista da Cavalieri, changes it to a more oblong sort of format. And the other versions of engravings that we have copying this painting change it in other sorts of ways, but generally they include all of the figures. What is remarkable about Steinberg's use of prints in regard to the Pauline Chapel frescoes and the others is how carefully he looks at them and compares them to the painting itself and notices things that people simply have never noticed before. He then feeds those observations into his own interpretation about the line of fate. But I think it's fair to say that he thinks Cavalieri and the others who copied these frescoes are actually making some changes, some quite subtle changes, because they don't understand this concept of the line of fate. What I'm showing you here are some details from Cavalieri's engraving compared to the original. And these are two things that Steinberg points out as consistent changes that the printmakers apply to this fresco, to this subject. One of them, as you could see called out in the white boxes, is that they shorten the beam of the cross that St. Peter is crucified on, so that the person who is carrying or raising the cross, his thigh actually is visible beyond the endpoint of the beam. The other thing, which is called out in the red rectangle, is that there is a figure, and he is unfortunately cut off in these details, but you could see him in the main view. He's wearing a kind of an he's pointing downward towards St. Peter, and as you could see, the lower half of his body in the fresco simply is not there. That's what the red square is pointing out. The printmakers complete that figure's body. They actually add the lower part of his robe and again change a void into a filled space. What I think Steinberg wants to say by pointing out these details that he saw by so carefully looking at the prints, is that the printmakers are in a sense stopping the line of fate. They do not want it to continue. Not that they know it's there, but they're unaware of it, unaware of its importance, whereas Michelangelo used exactly the details he did so that that line would be continued more completely through the painting. And here is the line of fate itself, superimposed on the crucifixion of St. Peter. What Steinberg means by this line of fate is that Michelangelo is reflecting on his own fate, that his own destiny, spiritual destiny, is in some ways imprinted upon these paintings, is inscribed upon these paintings in a way that is meaningful to him personally. It probably was not meaningful to the copyists. They saw no relevance at all in these particular details, so it was not necessary for them to make the connections as clearly as Michelangelo himself did. In the case of the crucifixion of St. Peter, the line of fate is drawn between the two figures who are called out in the details on the right side of the screen, and Steinberg sees both of these as self-portraits. Other people have recognized one or the other as self-portraits, but in saying that both of them are, and that they are making a meaningful connection between them, he is saying that this indicates how Michelangelo's own spiritual progress will take place. So what we have up in the upper left corner at the beginning of this line of fate is a portrait of Michelangelo in a turban, a kind of a blue wrap, surely meant to be seen as a sculptor's head covering, not truly a turban, but showing him perhaps a little skeptical, perhaps a little questioning about what is going on here, and being directed through the gesture of the man in the helmet next to him to look at St. Peter, to follow that line downward. The line then continues down along the crossbeam of St. Peter's cross, carries on throughout the lower right corner of the painting, but standing at that lower right corner, and apparently about ready to step out of that lower right corner, is the other figure that Steinberg sees as a self-portrait. Now, this other figure has a much longer beard, longer than Michelangelo ever grew a beard, so some question this. But the structure of the man's face and also the introspection of the character really do point to it being a self-portrait, and other artists, William Blake specifically, actually saw it as such. What does this line of fate show? It shows Michelangelo going from perhaps doubt to acceptance and a meditative stance, a stance that internalizes the meaning of the crucifixion of St. Peter. We will see that the line of fate in the Last Judgment similarly shows this kind of questioning of Michelangelo's own spiritual well-being. And finally, this brings us to the Last Judgment, the work that Michelangelo painted in the Sistine Chapel on the altar wall between 1538 and 1541. I've already mentioned the Last Judgment several times, but now I want to focus on the prince and how this idea of the line of fate plays out in Steinberg's interpretation. Steinberg wrote a very influential article called The Last Judgment as Merciful Heresy. And in that article, he starts by saying that the Last Judgment opened like a hit show. Well, I'm not sure it opened like a hit show. I'm not sure how many people were able to go into the chapel to see it, but it certainly was publicized like a hit show. It was reproduced verbally and in engravings dozens of times, much more than any other work of art by Michelangelo, or really by any other artist of the time. Engravings of the Last Judgment ranged from multi-plate engravings that were meant to be assembled, and when assembled would be about 5 feet tall, meant to be mounted on a wall or folded up and unfolded to be discussed in close detail. Others were much smaller. In this case, we are seeing one of the smaller prints. This is Martina Rota's engraving from 1569. It's about a foot tall, and probably 10 versions of this format of copy exist. Martina Rota's is one of the most popular of them, and we'll see that copies were made of it as well. As I've already said, the prints of the Last Judgment do reproduce the painting before it was censored, before the changes were made that made it more acceptable to a common viewing public. But there are some changes that the prints themselves make to the composition, and Steinberg was particularly interested in how much real estate, in a sense, is given to the hell scene, which is in the lower right corner of the fresco and of the copies. And you can make this comparison very easily, I think. Martina Rota actually makes the hell scene much larger than it is in the fresco itself. It starts with the image of the boatman, Charon, an image from Dante's Inferno, and carries all the way through to the Minos figure in the lower right corner. But there is much more space given to hell in the Last Judgment that Martina Rota actually constructs. This is one of those indications of how the printmakers were more inclined to reproduce what they thought a Last Judgment should be, even though they are paying attention to what Michelangelo created, but the convention is that hell should be bigger, and that is what they put into their copies. You can see also that they change the composition in other sorts of ways. For example, Rota's really does make the circle of saints around Christ much more clearly a circle, whereas Michelangelo's might be construed as a horseshoe or a parabola. Those sorts of ideas have come to minds of various interpreters. Now, the idea of the line of fate is one that Steinberg also brings to bear on the Last Judgment. And in this case, the line that he finds so meaningful starts up in the upper left corner of the fresco, moves through the crown of thorns that angel is holding in the upper left corner, through the wound on the side of Christ, through the skin that is being held by St. Bartholomew, through the face of a figure who is being pulled to hell, and then finally on to the lowest corner of hell, and ends in the genital region of the figure of Minos. I could say many things about all of those figures. Steinberg said many things about all of those figures. But what I really want to point out is that the printmakers, again, did not particularly see that line as significant. Steinberg sees it as another one of these indications of how Michelangelo is, in a sense, visually meditating on the path to salvation, that it runs through Christ's suffering, through the wound in his side, which is the source of all blessings, through the skin, which in fact has been identified as a portrait of Michelangelo, and then down into hell. And the skin itself is something that Steinberg focuses on, that is really put in almost a fulcrum position where it's not entirely clear where this image that represents Michelangelo's own soul, the state of his own soul, where it will end. Steinberg's interpretation is very much dependent upon the identification of that skin. And as he himself points out, it was not until 1920 or so that anybody recognized it as Michelangelo's face. What we see in this slide is the center area, the center plate from Beatrice's large-scale reproduction of The Last Judgment. And as you can see in the detail of that detail, there is the skin and there is an inscription that says Michael Angelus Inventor. These kinds of prints often would have the inventor indicated. The person who designed the plate would often be called out. But it is extremely unusual to see the inscription indicating who designed the original to be put in such a position that looks like a label. And I think that's what Steinberg really did point out and really was convinced of, that this is truly the identification of the artist. There are many other things to say about Steinberg's interpretation of Michelangelo, about his use of prints, and many more. I hope that we'll be able to talk about some of those in the discussion that will follow. But for now, let me again say thank you for listening. It's been a real pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much, Bernadine, for that deep dive into Michelangelo. We really appreciate that, and we'll look forward to addressing some questions that have already been put into the Q&A area. So as they occur to you, go ahead, please, and put your questions into the Q&A box. We're going to move on to our second speaker of the afternoon. Our second speaker is Patricia Emerson. Patricia, can you just say hello quickly so we have you pop up on the screen?
Hello to everybody. Did I pop?
You popped.
Okay.
Welcome. Patricia Emerson is professor at the University of New Hampshire, and she is the author of several books on the Italian Renaissance, including The Italian Renaissance and Cultural Memory, and a book on the discipline of art history itself, The Shaping of Art History. She has organized or contributed to a number of exhibitions, most recently Myth, Allegory, and Faith, the Kirk Edward Long collection of Mannerist prints at the Cantor Center for Visual Arts at Stanford, and Marc Antonio Raimondi and Raphael at the Whitworth Art Gallery in Manchester. Her forthcoming book, Moving Pictures in Renaissance Art History, examines film between 1920 and 1965 as an inheritor of the Renaissance challenge of pictorial narrative and also of the Renaissance invention of multiples made for the mass market. I'm going to go ahead and share her presentation now.
I don't expect ever to attend another art history lecture with as big and as intent an audience as came to hear Leo Steinberg's The Sexuality of Christ in Renaissance Art and in Modern Oblivion at Columbia in 1981. The huge auditorium was packed to capacity. I had to stand, if memory serves me. The history of art was something everybody seemed to care about, at least for that evening. There was also a line waiting to get into the Last Supper lectures at Harvard, the Norton series of 1995-96, published by Zone Books in 2001 as The Incessant Last Supper. Yet the atmosphere there seemed quite different, the audience less awed, though still impressed by Steinberg's rhetorical prowess and celebrity. No matter what you thought of his argument, he had an argument that you could debate about afterwards, and he delivered it with abundant panache. What I'm showing you here is some correspondence with the review. After the review of the book in the New York Review of Books, Andrew Butterfield and Leo Steinberg going back and forth about the gestures of the apostles at the Last Supper and how to interpret them. Steinberg had a kind of Baroque splashiness, formed at least partly in response to Panowski's humanistic frame of mind. He had learned much from Panowski. He appropriated the idea of hidden symbolism, for instance. But whereas for Panowski, hidden symbolism redeemed what might otherwise have looked like early secularism, for Steinberg it had a Freudian note. But it was clear from the atmosphere in Sanders Theatre in Cambridge that much had happened to the discipline of art history during that 15-year interval, and maybe especially to Renaissance art history, some of which is discussed by Joseph Kerner in the December 2004 Art Bulletin review of Steinberg's book on the Last Supper. As Kerner pithily put it, Steinberg champions engineered ambiguity in an era of ubiquitous indeterminacy. My purpose today is to take the 1981 lecture as a prompt to ask about the sexuality of virtue in Renaissance prints, both the sensuality of the personified virtues and the outright display of female private parts, what Alberti called in the second book of his treatise on painting, the obscene or offensive parts and all parts lacking in grace. The Italian text says more nearly, the parts of the body that are ugly to see. Even by the standards of later Renaissance imagery, the full frontal nudity of this small engraving of Fortitude by Sebald Boehm from 1539, only 39 by 25 millimeters, the size of a postage stamp, is more than slightly startling. Fortitude comes from a series of 8 engravings, Cognition and the 7 Virtues. Steinberg gave the complete set to the Blanton. Hope is also naked to a surprising degree, though scantily and conveniently draped. The virtues are given sequential numbers, with Cognition leading off. Cognition is an unusual subject, followed by prudence, charity, justice, faith, hope, fortitude, and temperance. They are not subdivided by that ordering into theological and cardinal virtues. Another set with Cognition was done in the Netherlands around 1570, and in that set the theological and cardinal virtues are sorted each into the proper category. In Hans Sebald's set, after hope and fortitude, the other most risque examples are prudence and justice, whose slit skirts and exposed legs derive quite directly from Dürer, as you see on the far right there, a detail of a woodcut. Throughout the series, the basic iconography is fairly standard, though not without interest. The stocks behind hope, for example, are unexpected, as is the sphere with temperance. Had stocks been used in the aftermath of the Peasants' War, we might wonder? Is the sphere a transplant from Dürer's Melancholia? which in Boehm's reduced version on the far right there is associated with measurement, specifically with the calipers on top of the sphere that offer little help in comprehending its measurements. Temperance has to do with measure, and spheres are a challenge both to the stability associated with virtue and to measurement. The lion is a customary attribute for fortitude, the broken column likewise. The wings are less expected. Hope, as in these two earlier examples, often has wings, but not fortitude. Closer to Boehm, Durer's Melancholia of 1514 in the middle here, while neither virtue nor vice, is a winged female personification. Georg Pence, on the far right here, somewhat peculiarly depicted vices with wings. Wings might simply imply the figure was to be understood as allegorical, as with the laurel wreaths on Boehm's figures. Truth, an allegorical figure, though not of virtue strictly speaking, we might expect to be presented naked. Botticelli's Naked Truth in the 1490s, pointing to heaven, is an early example, the beginning of a trend. Here's a 15th century verso of a bronze medal, usually described as the unveiling of truth, although it looks distinctly to me as though truth is resisting being veiled. Fame, which you see on the right in the Jacopo de Barbary and on the left in the Daniel Hopfer, paired in both cases with victory. Fame is sometimes nude, sometimes accompanied by victory, the nudity perhaps meant to insinuate the idea of true fame. Marcantonio Raimondi's Prudence, with her dishabille and skin-tight drapery, provides an important precedent for Boehm. It is not surprising that Marcantonio would play a part in the history of eroticizing prints for sale, given his infamous I Modi. Caravaggio's engravings of gods in niches from 1526, all of them The website for the Minneapolis Institute of Art suggests of Boehm's Temperance, which you see in the lower left here, that in a strange way, the figure's clinging dress and loose shoulder strap evoke the desires she urges people to keep in check. That echoes what Kerner called Steinberg's engineered ambiguity. And I can cite a supporting text, albeit from almost a century later, but an idea that had long been familiar. For Ottaviano Zucchero, son of Federico Zucchero, cognition was prerequisite for love of God. Similarly, in this set of engravings, cognition of virtue is presented as prior and prerequisite to love of virtue. Nudity signifies an object that is desirable. Framing the series as being governed by cognition may have been connected to Boehm's endowing the virtues with the cues to real-world passion, intellect paired with will, a theme we find amply elsewhere in Renaissance art and thought. But it remains disconcerting that Boehm in 1539 has upped the ante to full frontal nudity, even if on a reduced scale. Baldwin Gring's allegorical nude of 1529 is sometimes labeled Prudence. Highly reminiscent of Eve, the iconography has been inflected curiously, though the basic objective seems to have been to satisfy a taste for allegorical female nudes. That Prudence would be the most inclined to nudity of the virtues seems to have reflected the compatibility of truth and prudence. Prudence implies seeing things from multiple perspectives rather than rushing to judgment, and truth is revealed over time, sometimes depicted by the removal of clothing. In both cases, better sight produces better judgment. Giovanni Pisano's Prudence in Pisa Cathedral from 1310, in the pose of the Venus Pudica, and right next to Fortitude, incidentally, is still to this day a startling sight. And although the Pisa Fortitude is female and clothed, Fortitude as Hercules was often shown nude, heroically nude, at least in Italy. In Germany, although I can't show a definitive example of a male nude Fortitude, Hieronymus Hopfer copied the Hercules and Antaeus of Mantegna, and later than our Fortitude, Hans Sebald Boehm showed Hercules at his labors, sometimes with genitals visible and sometimes not. And for the sexy female Fortitude, Boehm had considerable company. The drawing on the left is cataloged as anonymous German 16th century, first half of the 16th century. And then you get Master IBs in the 1520s in the middle on the top, Aldegraver 1528, middle on the bottom, Lucas van Leyden from the Netherlands 1530 on the right. When in 1539 Hans Sebald Boehm made his set of virtues, he had to push the conceit to a kind of extreme to make his little virtue stand out. A sexy fortitude had already joined the ranks alongside the nude prudence, which in turn grew out of the idea of the bare truth. Part of Steinberg's impact was due to the accusation he addressed to his listeners that the ostentatious child penis had been repressed by viewers, that we had not been able to see what was right before us. He challenged viewers to examine their roles just as reception theory was waxing. By contrast, the sexualized virgin of the 16th century had already often been commented upon at some length, frequently in the context of developing the concept of Mannerist style. The virgin, whose breasts, nipples, and navel were all somewhat immodestly revealed through the drapery, was part of the normal commentary on Parmigianino's paintings, for example. This was not only the case in his paintings of the Virgin Mary, but in the example of the virgins with the lamps in the Santa Maria della Staccata, the wise virgins as well as the foolish ones, some of whose draperies are so very wet-seeming as to be ineffectual as covers, perhaps more so in the drawings than in the final paintings. And on the far right, you see a black and white slide of one of those preparatory drawings with the self-portrait of the artist. The general momentum of stylistic innovation promoted by classical models, by imitating the Cleopatra of the Vatican, for example, induced artists to make their figures more and more not only lifelike, but as if nude. And what was a lifelike and idealized female nude, if not a sexualized object? Even the many Lucretias who started out as portrayals of heroism often tended toward images of a woman whose allure was more obvious than her chastity. The two on the left are Lucretia. Similarly with Judith, on the far right, Dido, and Tomyris, heroines tended to be presented as powerful because they were enticing. The 2014 master's thesis here at Austin by Kendra Jo Grimmett placed Barthel Boehm's engraving of Judith, nude and seated, in its rich context of like imagery, with precedents as early as Nicoletta da Modena. The paradox of a virtuous figure of chastity shown in the nude clearly had appeal. Of his images of the Christ child, Steinberg never asked the anthropological question, that is, whether parents in certain cultures might in fact be inclined to regard a baby's penis with a certain fascination, and the art might simply be reflecting what was common cultural practice rather than deep theology. What could be less extraordinary within a traditional, if dated, framework than to take pride in the male sex of a baby? We might also wonder about Steinberg's own cultural context, that is, whether he might have been conditioned to think more about sexuality and images because he was living in an era with the first male frontal nudity in film, Age of Consent, 1969, as well as the first female frontal nudity, Women in Love, also 1969, both of which films caused some stir thereby. Donald Posner's article about the sexuality of Caravaggio's young boys appeared in 1971, and he included some religious paintings in his analysis of what he called the pederastic propensities of their creator. Nevertheless, it is true that the older literature often shied away from noticing sexuality as a theme in religious depictions. Dirty feet are more likely to be mentioned. Steinberg deliberately steered clear of the larger issue of sexuality in Renaissance art, dauntingly larger, focusing instead on the display of the child penis as evidence of a doctrinal meaning, as connoting the full post-lapsarian human nature assumed by Christ in the Incarnation. His question was narrowly iconographic. Since then, as the balance in our contemporary world has pivoted to image and away from text, iconography has seemed less and less crucial. I should also point out that the timing of Steinberg's thesis predated the nation's preoccupation with the potential for molestation in daycare centers. which surged in the late 80s, and which I would suppose would have been a considerably less propitious time to put forward such a thesis as his. The enthusiastic reception of his thesis had something to do with its timing, post-Posner and pre-daycare anxieties, as well as its inherent merits. As historians, we should not find that too surprising. The question today is precisely that dauntingly broader one in relation to Boehm's small-scale engraving of a distinctly fleshy, arguably strangely vulnerable fortitude. Why use a sexualized formal vocabulary for figures meant to convey something quite contrary to that? His hope is almost modest by comparison and clearly directed toward heaven. His fortitude is oddly defenseless. Sexy images sell well then as now. Boehm's exposed bodies no doubt attracted buyers. Fortitude had often been the least winsome of the virtues, and it might be supposed that Boehm was overcompensating. It might even be supposed that the frequent pairing of Mars and Venus, war and love, was latently operative, since fortitude is called for in war. But more plausibly, personifications attract attention if you make them nude, and the more nude, possibly, the better. My question today doesn't end, but only begins with why did Boehm render fortitude as a female for whom drapery is an adornment rather than a cover? I'm content to suppose that he was following the winds of cultural change, that delicious bodies were part of what was newly expected from visual artists, and his was neither the first nor the most outrageous response to this market trend. Aldegraver shows pubic hair, for instance, in a small-scale engraving of Lucretia, and Hans Sebald's brother Boehm shows an anus. It is not hard to find examples of fairly uninhibited presentations of nudity in Renaissance art, as on the right, Flora. That art could be daring at all, on any level, is not a given, but one of those new tenets that made the Renaissance a choice time to be an artist. But what particularly deserves analysis, I propose, are the steps of the progression from one artist's idea of how much might be dared to another's, and not always in the direction of greater outrageousness. How, why, and when did artists back off from prurient content, particularly if they did so without official weight being thrown at them, or, insofar as we can judge this, without the threat of censorship having been internalized? We know from Vasari, for instance, that Raimondi's I Modi went too far for the papal authorities, and that Fra Bartolomeo's St. Sebastian of 1514 was taken down because of its appealing to female worshippers in the wrong way. Infamously, we know that the nudes in Michelangelo's Last Judgment were censored as being inappropriate for so august a setting, a feeling still prevalent when the cleaning was undertaken 30 years ago. But was it only the authorities who exerted force over how the history of art developed? Did artists need something so blunt as the Council of Trent in order to reconsider the trajectory of stylistic innovation? Might not artists have backed off from the direction they had once supported, whether for their own reasons or because of how they understood the public will? Let me offer a parallel. If we take from cinema the example of post-war neorealism, we see a turn away from glamour, specifically from Hollywood glamour and its sexiness, toward women who do not function as diegetic fashion models, and also toward rather unwashed, sometimes scrawny men. Rossellini, De Sica, and early Fellini, working in the late 40s and 50s, wanted a less alluring instantiation of the world of film, not because they were hemmed in by the threat of censorship, but because they rejected the stylized portrayal of life so often featured in Hollywood films. The need to be fashionable and suave was seen to limit the storytelling, and the post-war era was conducive to grim storytelling. Was there an analogous phenomenon in printmaking in the mid-16th century, a turn toward imagery based more in unpolished reality, newly valued, as Italian and German populations reeled under the social, political, and the religious upheavals? Can we find, well before the Baroque, artists looking at ordinary life, possibly the same artists who sometimes produced very stylized, highly mannerist imagery, both being potentially symptoms of lack of interest in the antique? Parmigianino's drawing of a woman seated on the floor is done from life, as is this drawing of a woman in a chair, which is not the case for the almost dancing women of the Stoccata. At least they were not taken from life anywhere near so directly. When Raphael drew from life, he was almost always thinking about what could later be made into a painting. Parmigianino taught himself how to draw from life in a newly unfiltered way, drawing whatever he saw, like someone taking digital pictures versus someone using film who has to worry about waste. He left an enormous number of drawings, trying in many of them to take off the blinkers his training had instantiated, and sometimes making etchings on the basis of such drawings. The one on the right's an etching. Parmigianino had time in the aftermath of the sack of Rome to draw prolifically, and he lived in a time that newly had ready access to paper and also to mirrors. He had gained flexibility in how he looked around himself, and he understood that the convex mirror distorted reality. So when his drawings recorded exactly what he saw, he made himself a better mimic of nature than the mirror. When he etched his lovers in the woods, the middle one here, we may surmise that he knew that he was backing off from what his predecessors had done, that he was lowering the explicitness with which he rendered amorousness, and not because of any prudishness. His lovers is not part of a series. The figures are not identifiable. He was making progress towards seeing the world less conventionally. We owe it to him to leave the image relatively indeterminate, as Rembrandt left his lovers deep in foliage in the 3 trees. You see that detail on the far right. Rembrandt's Lucretia, now in Washington, owes something of its composition to Raimondi's engraving after Raphael, but the inner psychology has been made to overweigh the mixture of heroic resolve and sexy display in the Raphael design. Even Veronese's Lucretia from the 1580s is a woman more honored for her chastity than her desirability, without obviating the materiality of Veronese's oil paint. We do little honor to the artists if we automatically chalk up all efforts to tone down the sexuality of images to fear of censorship. The pictures show us both how artists featured sexuality, but also how they backed off from that tactic in search of other effects. For one thing, not all naturalistic nudes are sexy. Witness Barthel Baham's astonishing image of a mother overwrought and grieving her stillborn child. The inscription assures us that, horrible as her situation is, she is better off than an avaricious man. If ever an artist was testing the parameters of imagery, this is such a case. Much as we might like to think of the visual arts as vehicles of rare intellectual or theological distillations, their value almost always lies elsewhere, whether in selectively affirming the commonly held values of a group of people, or in exercising a precious freedom, whether the freedom to assert an audacious comparison, or simply the freedom to be frivolous. This is Hans Sebald Baham drawing and engraving Frivolous. Step by step, Baham and his peers may have decided against the cognitive dissonance they had once chosen to create, allowing a loving patience to wear inconspicuous clothing so that we focus on her state of mind, or turning increasingly to landscape, having temporarily exhausted some of the potential of the figure. The exposed body in Baham's Fortitude may suggest, and may have been meant to suggest, the animalistic will requisite for the practice of virtue, but the engraving concretizes only a single piece of the puzzle of Baham's ongoing judgment about how to put to use the power of representation. That trajectory has more historical significance than any single iconography. As with archaeological finds, context matters. One image creates the circumstances in which the next is made. An artist dares something, and then that artist or another one dares to deny that form of daring. Eliding love of virtue with carnal desire, a kind of runoff from contemporary Neoplatonism, may have helped Baham make his Fortitude, but his decision at other times to tone down the nudity doesn't necessarily imply a change in his morality, or even a response to changing mores around him. It may show, more than anything else, a shift in his pictorial judgment, deciding that what was dared might not be worth repeating is a decision that can be taken on the individual level or by multiple artists within a cultural tradition, or it can be enforced by the power elite. Art historians have, for some time now, been learning to be wary of conceptualizing the history of art as a succession of triumphs, the path of progress forged by indomitable genius, artistic genius. Instead, the history of art makes more sense conceptualized as a mere concatenation of trials. The preconditions of those trials may be more telling than the results. And what we are studying, our history of visual creativity, may lie closer to the history of judgment than of ideas. In closing, I would like to say a word on behalf of collecting prints, old ones but also new ones. A few prints that Leo Steinberg collected, a very few, I have myself. Like books, which you own conjointly, like the Bible, and unlike a relic, more or less identical impressions can be owned by many people simultaneously. No NFTs allowed. The pesky idea that prints are lesser works of art because they are multiples ignores their value as originals held in common. To have access to the prints as material objects, ridges of ink on tactily gratifying paper, while also having access to the ever-expanding digital resources, many of them freely accessible day and night from anywhere in the world, promises a new era of print research. I wish all those who have access to the Steinberg gift very stimulating studies. There are so many prints in our history.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It seems like we've got our talks and we've rejoined ourselves properly back together. Good job, team. And we're here now together to take a look at some of the questions that have come up. So I will go ahead and just jump right in. Those of you who are sticking with us, please keep dropping them into the Q&A box. Let me just start directly with Bernadine. There's a question from Suzanne Borsch about the reversal of the Pietà sculpture in Alberti's print and in other prints too. So does Steinberg comment about that, or do you have comments about reversals of sculptures?
Actually, Steinberg, he reproduces Cherubino Alberti's print, and we're talking about the print of the Florentine Pietà. He reproduces it backwards. So he wants to show it as if it were a document of the sculpture itself that we know. That is not usually the case in Steinberg's work. He doesn't flip things around, but I double checked this because, you know, in my putting together the talk, I was thinking, wait a minute, I didn't really think Cherubino Alberti did that, but you can see very clearly in his article that the inscriptions are all reversed, and I don't think that there is an impression that that is flipped in that orientation. What I would say, it's interesting to think about the reversal of prints, what gets reversed and what does not get reversed, to think about it in some kind of systematic way. As far as I know, the prints of the Last Judgment, which are by far that's the painting that got reproduced most often, or the work that got reproduced most often, they always show the orientation of the image like the fresco. I can't think of an example that does not, which is sort of interesting all by itself, because prints just typically invert things. But I think the iconography of a Last Judgment is actually so important to anybody that the damned are on what we think of as the right side, the blessed are on the left side, and so on. So it's important to keep that orientation right. A printmaker, of course, could do a reversed image and then could re-reverse it. The other thing I would say about that is that the model of Martina Rota's print was probably more often what was being copied than the actual fresco itself or any other version of the fresco, and there were painted copies as well. So, but that certainly was something that was copied repeatedly, including in that very interesting example that you showed, Holly. So, you know, so that's another thing, but it does seem like at least a choice is being made by the printmakers to make make sure that orientation is correct. With sculpture, I think it goes various ways. First of all, the sculpture, Michelangelo's sculpture, is not reproduced as often as, well, certainly not the Last Judgment, but it's not consistently reproduced. The sculpture of the Risen Christ that's now in Santa Maria sopra Minerva, there's 2 reproductions. They're both reversed. There's other things. As far as I know, the Vatican Pietà, I can't think of an image that is reversed. So I don't think there's a real consistency there. And as I said, some of it might be the fact that the printmakers themselves knew that the image was significant in a particular orientation. That's the best I could say.
Thank you. And then just to follow up that one, Bernadine, how did Martina Rota get such an accurate pre-censored print? I mean, what would he have been looking at? Was he actually looking at the original, or was he looking at someone's drawing of the original?
I think that there were several models that were circulating, and no matter when the prints were made, they all show the pre-censored state of it. The censoring process took place starting in 1564, and many other prints were made after that. There was, I think, one of the most important models at first was Marcello Venusti's painting that was made almost immediately after the fresco was finished. There were also drawings that we hear about, but that don't survive. There is a very large-scale print that Niccolò della Casa did, again, issued in a number of different plates, and the plates come out, the earliest of them come out almost immediately after the unveiling of the fresco. After there is a certain number of these things that are out there, I think they're just working off of the prints that have been published. Bonassone had a full view of the fresco that he put out. I'm forgetting the exact date, but it's in the 1540s also. I think that could have served as a model. So in fact, the copies are serving as models rather than artists going into the Sistine Chapel and really looking at the thing itself.
So in fact, censoring it didn't stop the circulation of these illicit, or these considered profane images in a sense. I mean, it was fine to censor it for those who were going to see it in person, but then it was already out there and it was escaped, and more people were seeing the uncensored version than the censored.
Well, that's exactly right. And I think it also shows that there was a market for these uncensored versions, that people were really interested in these things, and maybe not so much in seeing a bunch of loincloths, but.
Maybe it also reflects the idea that the problem was really with seeing those nudes in that room. If you took it out of the room, then they didn't mind.
Yeah, that's a really good point. When you're in this very sacred space, where's your mind supposed to be going? Which actually, Patricia, leads me to a question for you. I'm curious about, so many of the images you showed were in print, and I'm curious about how significant is the medium for these nude images, these images that were kind of visually shocking. You had a few paintings, but I'm curious about the balance and what you see as the importance of the medium there.
I think that there could easily be a complementary study of metals. There are a lot of similar images in metals, sometimes earlier than in prints. So the small scale, privately owned object that you could store discreetly seems to have had a certain amount of freedom.
Well, it's interesting because I've always sort of heard, Lucas Cranach's paintings, well, those weren't going to be displayed publicly, or those were sort of more for private use. Does the same argument apply then to these small prints and metals, or do you see it as it's the audience and the public that it's meant for, and the type of display that it can give the freedom for that sort of subject matter?
One of the great developments, I think, of the early modern period is the beginning of private collecting, and that has enormous consequences for what artists can do. They may have always been interested in doing those things, but they didn't have an outlet for it.
Yes. So there's a question here for you from Jeff Smith. What is the role of size and viewer intimacy in Bayham's lascivious prints? And Fortitude is one of his more modest female nudes, Jeff says.
Yeah, I think it's important that they're small scale, sure. When you're going to take a daring step, the way you see in altarpieces in the early 15th century, you see more daring things done in the predella than you see in the main frame of the altarpiece. Mm-hmm. It's just easier to get away with things that don't draw attention to themselves as much.
Yeah, so there's a comparison. Are these the Playboy magazines of their day, or but that's interesting because you're also arguing that these are the virtues. So I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, the representations of the goddesses, I think, would be a closer parallel to Playboy magazine, which I've never looked at. But I do think that the imagery of the female nude with genitalia exposed is at a certain point fairly commonplace, but it's usually in the instance of pagan subject matter. It was one of the freedoms that you got with pagan subject matter. It's sort of convenient to have a whole sort of set of figures with narratives attached to them that are good stories, lively stories, but you don't need to believe it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think you mentioned this in your talk, and there's we have another print in the exhibition, The Vanity of Vanities, All is Vanity, but it's an incredibly beautiful print with gorgeous calligraphy around the edge and a beautiful half-nude woman touching all of the, all the things of the world, touching crowns and chalices and gold coins. And when I give tours, I talk about it's like a push-pull print. It's pulling you in because it's so beautiful, but then the words around the edge are pushing you away, saying, be careful of what you're looking at. And so I wonder whether that kind of push and pull or conflicted viewing is also part of those virtues that you're looking at, or whether that's not the case in this.
I think so. And I think that more directly, as you were talking, I was picturing the images of a beautiful woman with death. It's a fairly standard iconography, but I think the idea there is that push and pull that you're talking about, that there's the worldly beauty and then the sort of memento mori that goes with it as its opposite.
So this is a nice question for both of you who, let's see, Patricia, you talked about actually going to the lecture where Steinberg presented his thesis on the sexuality of Christ. How controversial was Steinberg in his day and still now? Could you place him historically in your kind of development as a scholar? And
I think he was controversial. I mean, there were two responses after the lecture, and one was by John O'Malley, more about the theology, and one was by Julius Held. And Julius Held's response did not get published in Representations when they published the lecture. They published the O'Malley response. They didn't publish the Held response. And the Held tried in a very painstakingly careful way, which was not Steinberg's style, to offer alternative readings of some of the dozens and dozens of images he had barraged us with across the evening. And I think that that many people would have sided with Held. I mean, Held had a very scholarly mind in a traditional sense, and the appeal of Steinberg was that he was so charismatic and dynamic, and and less historically based. He was interested in the theology, but he wasn't as much a historian. And it was a time when art history was sort of shifting away to some extent from really being a branch of history to being something that was more connected to philosophy and literary criticism and other disciplines. So I think, depending on who you talk to, you'd get very different reactions. But everyone knew him. So he sort of helped bring the discipline together, and he certainly got people interested in the discipline. I would say, from Berenson to Steinberg, there were art historians who were major public figures, and that was very good for the discipline.
Thank you. Yeah, Bernadine, how about with the Michelangelo scholarship?
Well, I think that it depends upon what piece of his scholarship we're talking about. With regard to the Sexuality of Christ, I think it was very controversial right when it came out. Lots of resistance to it, but I think now people probably do accept what he's saying. You can see, when you're reading other things, probably even textbooks, you would probably see indications of it. I think his ideas about the Merciful Heresy thesis that he had, that hell is not permanent, that Michelangelo is really treading on thin ice, shall we say, because he is really agreeing with Protestant ideas, or at least some Protestant ideas, that were really things that he had learned through Vittoria Colonna and the other people in her circle. As far as I could tell, that is absolutely accepted now, that everybody who writes about Michelangelo in the Vittoria Colonna context and in his later Pietas, they pretty much assume that that was exactly right, that was what he believed, and that other people believed it, and it might have been something he could have been condemned for back in the later 16th century, but it was. But he avoided it partly because it was so, it was a private belief, I would say, his circle with Vittoria Colonna. But even then, like, people would say that Vittoria Colonna would have been called out for a heretic, and that Michelangelo somehow, he certainly withdrew in his own work. He became much more withdrawn. And I think partly because of all the criticism that came out after the Last Judgment. But in terms of Steinberg's own interpretations, I think people actually are accepting it pretty well.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to scoop up a couple questions that I'm just going to answer since I curated this exhibition. One is there an inventory of Steinberg's prints at the Blanton, so we can see which prints there are, including those by Bayham? If you're specifically interested in Bayham prints, you can search our online catalog, and then they all will have credit lines. We are revamping our database, and in May we'll be having a new interface that's it'll be even easier to use, and there will be a specific kind of what I think was a tile that you can click on, and it will show you all of Steinberg's prints here. So there's maybe 3,500 of those that have Steinberg provenance. Amy Worthen had a question about this really interesting moment, right, when Michelangelo copies Martin Schoengaurer's Temptation of St. Anthony, and is there any connection there? So knowing that Michelangelo's earliest painting is a copy of a print, Steinberg does actually, in his essay, What I Like About Prints, he makes an argument that one of the figures in the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel is modeled on one of those demons. And so that was, by copying that print, it was sort of, part of Michelangelo's mental repertoire, or that it shows up again. So just to answer that question there. All right, back to our two panelists. So Patricia, Alison Stewart is asking about Bayham's prints, and she said Bayham prints can go way beyond nudity to being more sexually provocative, showing genitalia, interaction of nude figures. the virtue angle is interesting that you raised, but the parallel might be his representation of some biblical Old Testament scenes. Or I guess proposing that. And so I suppose nudity versus sexually provocative ones.
Yeah, I was dealing with the nudity because of the Steinberg framework, but certainly more could be done not only with the Old Testament narratives, but his oeuvre overall has lots of material that's related. Some of it later than, it's not as though he became more conservative about showing genitalia suddenly in 1539. It depends on the context.
Great. And then, so we have another question. Those you may have seen the morning talk where Jennifer Roberts showed images of Picasso's sleep watchers. And so there's a sort of a sense of voyeurism, perhaps, of someone being watched while they're sleeping. And Patricia, you've written about satyrs regarding or infringing on reclining Venus figures. Could you all talk about the role of voyeurism with us as print collectors or print viewers, or this iconography of voyeurism and how it relates to us as viewers and art lovers?
Well, think about that one for a minute. Yeah, it's a little more complicated as a woman, I'll say that. Something depends on whether, to go back to the morning and not just to the sleepwalkers, but to the raising of Lazarus, whether you really are thinking that you're there in the image or not. And I guess part of what I enjoy about prints is that I don't feel they make that demand on me. I mean, I look at the raising of Lazarus and I see lines on paper. I mean, I also see this biblical story. I see the expressiveness of the figures, but I don't insinuate myself into a print image. So if insinuating yourself into an image that shows sexual activity is the definition of voyeurism, then I would say that the medium militates against that. I think other people would differ.
Well, and is that one of the critiques of Steinberg is that, is he assuming a male gaze? Do we, I think that that's historic in art history, we've assumed a male gaze. And I did wonder about that too, with some of the works that you're showing. Are we assuming that? And is that, I think in the sort of the surviving albums, print albums we have, they seem to have been mainly owned by men, but we do know women were intimately involved in the print trade as print, wives of printmakers are selling. And so it's not that they have no relation to print. So are there thoughts about, who is gazing at these and who's collecting them, and does the gender of that person make a difference?
I think sorry, can I just say a word? I think it would be really interesting to get to see if there is any evidence of female collectors, if there are albums that we know were owned by women. And I don't know if Peter Parshall is still with us or if any of the other audience members know anything about it, but I do know that there is research on some of the collectors of albums, but as far as I know, none have been identified as female collectors, and it just would be interesting to know if there are any out there. Patricia, I
think I would say that one can assume that the gradual enhancement of the subject of the female nude as an object of equal admiration to the male nude was something that would have interested the female populace at the time.
Yeah.
It can't be all bad.
Well, yeah, it's a very interesting question, and then you just think how much how much do we make assumptions based on our current culture and, the moment that we're in? And of course, trying to historicize our own gazes is important. I think that one of the critiques of Steinberg's Sexuality of Christ, right, comes from scholars that Christ is often also portrayed as female. There's metaphors in which Christ is female. So, Caroline Bynum saying that. So just thinking, and then we often have always thought in binaries too. And so I think these are interesting questions to continue posing. As you say, Patricia, I loved that idea of prints as originals held in common, because I think it creates this beautiful community. So we each have our own original, but there is a connection between everybody who owns or even looks at the same print. The idea that it can be in multiple places at the same time. And we talked this morning about printmaking as collaborative, and I wonder whether we can think of print ownership too, as, we're looking at the same thing in different places at the same time, and that there's kind of a communal aspect in that looking, which in these days of separation is so appealing. So
I'll second that.
We've gotten lots of questions about, is this being recorded? And it is. Almost all of Blanton's programs are recorded and available on our website within a week or so. Let's see. Peter Partial has weighed in. Thank you, Peter. He once went through the whole of Lucht's collection marks. So those of you who don't know Lucht, now it's online, but this is a collection of looking at all the little stamps on the backs of prints and drawings, because when collectors used to, a collector could have their own little basically rubber stamp, which would have their identifying information on there. And they've all been collected and categorized, and you can read a little biography about each collector. So Peter went through those, and he found that there are basically no women with collector's marks except a small number in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and virtually all in America. So
you're never going to be able to make 16th century women into full members of society. Just not possible.
So again, maybe looking at, I don't know. You could imagine, it kind of depends where you look to, and perhaps in female monasteries or places like that, in books and things, and wondering, the libraries there, maybe there's something to be discovered in individual case studies. So, but again, I just invite everybody to come to the Blanton and look at our works. I thank you so much for joining us from North Carolina and New Hampshire and everybody all over. And it's really wonderful to be in this community of scholars here and interested parties. So thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure to share this day with you.